Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. Today, we have a slightly different episode planned for you today. But before we introduce the topic, today I'm joined by two lovely gentlemen, Brett Patterson and Ryan Taylor. Gentlemen, what's going on?
Howdy, howdy.
What up?
Amazing. I'm really excited for today. As you guys know, but the listeners don't know yet, the theme for today is overrated, underrated training edition. And we each have three topics that we're going to table and kind of relatively quickly, I guess, per topic, hash them out a little. Hopefully this week I'll have the chance to go. Sometimes in past episodes, we table some things and then I don't get to talk because you guys are so bloody interesting. But I got some interesting topics today that I think have the possibility of being either controversial or hot takes. So I'm excited to dig into them. That being said, I don't want to lead the way. I do want one of you guys to lead the way. I will go second. Actually, how about this? Like we did last time, we'll go one each, 3 times around, total of 9. Good. How's the math on that one?
Dope.
Does that track?
You nailed it.
All right. So who wants to go first? Either Brett or Rye. Dig in with your first overrated, underrated.
I mean, I got an easy one to start, one that I think the training world has caught on to probably a little bit over the last decade is balance tools like Bosu balls or using Swiss balls for balance or like balance boards, wobble boards, those kinds of things. So growing up, and especially doing a lot of ski training growing up, they were a pretty common tool. Like we would have them out at dryland trainings. I would use them a bit in the gym. And then, something popped up on Instagram one day that it was like, hey, according to the research, there isn't really a lot of carryover on these tools. Like basically, if you get really good at a balance board, you get really good at the balance board and not really that much else. And so training like, the vestibular system directly or on the surfaces that you're going to be playing on if you're practicing balance for a sport. Or even just day-to-day life, like just like solid ground, but, making that balance a little bit more challenged using different stances it has a lot more carryover than using these kind of ultra-specific tools.
So you're saying it's overrated?
Overrated, yes.
Ooh.
Balance tools are overrated.
Right. Anything you want to add on that?
So I'm actually going to have a surprising answer. I'm going to say they're underrated. Now, within a very specific context, because I feel like underrated, overrated is
it's
also
a nuanced
based,
answer, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, an underrated, overrated is based on like what is the general public opinion. So I agree with Brett. I think there was a period of time where they were like all the craze, especially with like sport training and stuff like that. Then there was this big wave where people saw that like sport performance, not only was it not improved, in some cases it was actually worse because it was less specific. And I think we know enough now that like training on unstable surfaces doesn't actually improve your balance. It improves your skill of training that particular exercise. The reason why I'm saying that it is underrated is like a lot of things in the fitness industry, the
pendulum has swung.
Pendulum swung really far.
Yeah.
Where I think that there's application, and this has been demonstrated clinically, is in rehabilitation for ankle injuries. So the outcomes with ankle injuries using unstable surface training are quite positive. So I think that it's only underrated in the sense that everybody shits on them, but it is still something that I think has an application in a very specific area. I would not recommend it probably for the most part for a lot of other things, but I think that especially because we have data that's not just mechanistic, but also outcome oriented that has demonstrated a positive effect. I think that it's something that could be a tool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think to your point, you guys both bring up really good points. We just need to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, I do think that, like you were saying, Brett, that balance implements, within the past like 20 years or so. Shout out to David Weck, who created the Bosu ball. It's a sarcastic shout out.
Shout out.
I know. I was like, oh no, I hope no one picked up on that, but you did. what was I going to say? Yeah, the pendulum swung really far towards pro balance tools. And at that point, it was definitely overrated when it comes to a wide array of applications. Um, and uh, and then, you know, over the years, as we've accumulated data, the pendulum swung really far the other direction, which is fuck balance tools, generally speaking. Um, and I think that in the grand scheme of things, their efficacy is somewhere in the middle. Like, I think, how would I say? Like you were saying, when it comes to the skill of balancing, whether it be in like real world scenarios or within athletic contexts, specificity is king. There's a really interesting, and I'll have to see if I can find this study at some point. This is a study that Tom Purvis referenced a lot during the RTSM program that I did in the States. And he talked about how they, in the MLB, they did a study with some of the athletes, or perhaps in one of the leagues, kind of that serves as a feeder system. They gave some of these athletes weighted bats and regular bats, and they got the folks with the weighted bats to swing and swing and swing, and they all subjectively were like, "I'm hitting so much harder." When they go back to a regular bat, and then they tested it. They took the folks with the weighted bats, they warmed them up as they normally would with the weighted bat, and then they would go and they would hit. And subjectively, they're all like, yes, that went further. And across the board, even though their felt like their felt sense was that they were more effective, they were actually objectively less effective because of how much batting relies on timing. And the second you take a bat that's heavier, it fucks with the timing. And even though you might have more force that you can exert, the compromised timing was net counterproductive to a little bit less force, but really like accurate skill. And so I do think that generally speaking, the adaptations that people look for from a balance perspective tend to be very, very specific, whether it be even in like a rehab context or in athletic contexts. One of the ways that I have found it to be useful, where I will sometimes use it, is with Gen Pop. If they love it, like, it's just like one of the questions that I ask myself all the time is, what's my way in to be able to get people to do health promoting activities? If I'm working with a general fitness person, if they fucking like Bosu ball push-ups more so than regular push-ups, and they go hard in the paint with Bosu push-ups, I'm actually not opposed to leveraging that, acknowledging that we're making trade-offs, but I'm choosing to prioritize adherence and training enjoyment, and like kind of sowing the seeds of long-term sustainability. So that would be my answer. But I do think overrated. I think it's complicated.
I think all of our answers are
man.
probably going to be it's complicated. It's nuanced.
We'll see.
I just want to add one thing just
let's do
to like further prove your point, ET, about the skill acquisition piece. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, you know, if we're talking about athletes, like we end up talking a lot about, you know, hypertrophy and strength training and stuff like that on this podcast. And we don't tend to talk a lot about athletics, but this is where training for sport becomes different, because there's a skill component to the sport. Like, there's a technical component. There was another study that I saw as well, where they took sprinters and they had them train with, I believe they were parachutes, like something that you've seen, you know, a lot in football.
For sure. You can buy that shit at Sport Check.
And very, very similar to what they would have found with the baseball swing study. The people that trained with parachutes actually ended up with slower 100-meter sprint times, because their sprinting stride changed. And because the technique required to run the 100-meter is so specific, and then they practiced a different skill, it actually degraded their skill of having a specific running style for their sport. So whatever advantages they thought that they were getting from essentially like adding resistance to their stride actually made them worse technically, and then therefore compromised their times.
It's interesting. Yeah, in the case of ski racing, which I'm very familiar with, like, I don't really know of any tool that can effectively compare to the balance requirements on a ski hill. Like, it's not only you're on a steep, icy, but grippy surface because you've got an edge to hold you down. but it's also, you're also in motion. Like a ski turn happens, and in the case of slalom, in less than a second. And so it's dynamic and quick, and your balance is changing, across your center of mass throughout that turn, and suddenly you've got to switch to a new edge. So there's some tools that people have used to try to emulate that in a gym setting, but like to be honest, like the only thing you can really do is get out on the hill and do some turns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
All right,
Ryan.
ET, what's your first take?
Oh, you're gonna make me go?
Yes, sir.
All right. So I'm gonna
So
lead
you're
with
going second.
All right. Yeah. Here we go. Cardio for fat loss, overrated or underrated? What do you guys think?
Overrated.
Overrated?
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, like it'll work, I guess. But is it the best tool?
I would agree, man. I think that it's incredibly overrated for fat loss. Unfortunately, that's such a huge reason why people do it. And I think that I have just a few thoughts on this that I'd really love to hear your take on this. As someone who has been doing a lot of running, I actually just signed up. So, I mean, as you guys know, I have my 51K, but I just signed up today for a training race, as I have the Geneva Marathon that I'm running in May.
Nice.
So just signed up for that today. And there are very few things that make you want to eat like a fucking animal other than running. And the degree to which I think for a lot of folks that it drives up appetite far exceeds the caloric output. Now, of course, like the caloric output is mega. If you're running for, if you go for a 2-hour run or like an hour or whatever run, huge caloric output. Absolutely. And the way that it potentiates hunger is uncomfortable. It's I don't know if you've felt that, Brett, but
Oh yeah. I'd put swimming up there with it too. Same thing, cardio in a cold pool. Like you get out and you just want to eat a horse.
it's insane, man. Yeah. And so I think that like, if we think about practically, because of how much it just drives up hunger signaling, I've personally found it to be very ineffective for fat loss. I think, and perhaps the caveat there would be specifically running. I think that if we lump cardio, like if we include walking in that,
Yes, that's where I would make a distinction.
I would view walking as perhaps being a little bit more fat loss promoting, because it just doesn't stimulate as like ravenous hunger.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I think when people think about cardio, they're thinking about running, they're thinking about the elliptical and, doing stairs or whatever for an hour. I think that's overrated for fat loss. And I think it's really underrated for health promotion. Yep. I think that like people should be doing that stuff because of the health promotion benefits. And the body composition ones are secondary, and they should be prioritizing other things like resistance training and a dialed in nutrition plan.
Yeah, I'll add to that. What you had mentioned at the end was going to be one of my points too, is
gotcha, bitch.
It is overrated in the sense that if we're looking explicitly at weight loss, and then usually fat loss is what people mean by that, it is just an energy balance thing. All of the tools that we use for people to lose fat all need to create some kind of caloric deficit. So that is like the governing idea. And cardio just doesn't burn that many calories. So you just don't make that much of a dent. And as you said, it often drives hunger up. So there's another phenomenon, I can't remember what the name of it is, but something that we see a lot with people as well is when they have a hard bout of exercise, they often compensate by then slowing down their activity for the rest of the day.
Yes.
So then some of that ends up actually potentially being less activity.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
And then, as you had mentioned, I do like differentiating between what like NEAT or, usually I just use steps as like a proxy for that, because it doesn't drive the same level of fatigue, which I think is really important. And over the course of days, you can end up actually with a decent amount of caloric consumption just by moving around. What I would say is I think that cardio, and what I'll say with cardio is like where your heart rate is over 120, 130 beats per minute.
Sure.
So like something that you can't maintain kind of a normal conversation, etc.
You can't maintain a conversation at 120?
Okay, 120, yeah. Like 130. I'm out of breath at 130 for sure.
Your homie's out of breath at 80.
That's true too.
I love you,
But
man.
I think that it is
funny.
indirectly beneficial for, I'll just say, body composition in general. So while the caloric consumption isn't significant, because of the health promotion and the fact that it can aid in improving people's insulin sensitivity, oftentimes also improving digestion, those benefits, actually more so honestly from a muscle gain perspective, is underrated. So I think cardio is underrated as an aspect for building muscle because of the fact that it promotes a healthier sort of internal environment. And the last thing I'll sort of add to this is I also think that when people, I'm just kind of painting with a broad brush here, but a lot of time when people talk about wanting to lose weight, a lot of the time is they want to look better. And the scale number doesn't actually matter that much. So if you get somebody where, as you had mentioned sort of at the end, having a focus on resistance training, etc., and I see this probably most commonly with women, if they can buy into something like that, like they might not lose any weight. They might even be heavier. But the fact that their shape has changed, where like maybe they have a little bit more muscle in their legs and their glutes and maybe in their shoulders, so they actually developed this hourglass shape. What they didn't actually care about was the weight number or the number on the scale, sorry. They cared about their shape changing and then they're happy with that. So I think that sometimes people they almost confuse what they want with what they really want.
100%.
So
100%. Really good points. Brett?
Cool. Yeah, like I think that it can have, like Ryan said, like it can have some positive benefits to like work capacity and like your ability to like push in the gym and maybe take slightly shorter rests or get a longer workout in. And that's probably going to have overall like a larger benefit to, you know, shape change or weight loss down the line. I'm like, I will always sing the praises of running. I like have been doing it consistently since I was like 12. But, you know, I've never done it to lose weight. It was always, the goal was always like run further, run faster, or help out my other sports.
100%. Love it. So consensus, cardio for fat loss, overrated and underrated when it comes to health promotion and other secondary or tertiary effects that people don't normally associate or perhaps aren't the reasons why they start cardio, but very important for those. Ryan, how about you?
All right. So my first one is training to failure.
Ooh. This is specifically resistance training or like aerobic training?
So resistance training to failure.
Okay.
Curious what you guys think first.
Brett?
I mean, like, I think it can go either way. Like, I don't think it's healthy for every workout, every set to go to failure. But I think it can be used as a tool on occasion. I don't know if I've got an underrated or overrated for this one. I don't know how popular training to failure is in your average gym, just because I don't attend a lot of those. So yeah, I'm going to go with it's complicated. If that's an okay answer, I'll take the bullet.
Appropriately
it's like a 2007 rated Facebook status.
Yeah. I think on my end, my initial thought went to like, this is like through the lens of a client, like an untrained client. I
wouldn't say necessarily untrained.
No, excuse me. But that's kind of where my answer is coming from.
Okay.
Like it's from that perspective. I think when it comes to clients that we work with, I do think it's an underutilized tool. Because generally speaking, I think one of the things that's a really important skill for people to acquire and also to become comfortable with is the feeling of effort. And the feeling of effort is, if people have a noxious relationship to the feeling of effort, and it's associated as bad because it's uncomfortable, that's at least in my experience is a pretty predictable hindrance to progress. And so, at least in my opinion, with a lot of the people that I work with, not training hard enough is a huge opportunity for them And naturally, and I think you've touched on this before, Rye, most people, even if they feel like they're going to failure, gun to their head, they usually still have a good amount of repetitions remaining. So subjective failure perhaps is actually not that, it actually tends to not be true muscular failure. So in actuality, it might be closer to a 3 RIR or maybe even 5, some people 10. And I find that that is more common than people that actually get to 0 RIR or 1 or even 2. So for that reason, and the importance of effort and people getting comfortable with that and how that propels most fitness goals forward, I think it's underrated. That being said, of course, to your point, Brett, I think always going hard in the paint all the time on every single workout for every single exercise eventually will just create too much fatigue for people. I mean, depending on their program. So it's not a silver bullet or a smoking gun, excuse me, for progress, but net underrated would be my opinion.
So that's a lot of your points are very similar to what mine would be as well. So I would say
we're basically married.
I know, buddy.
Yeah.
Put a ring on it, baby. Yeah, I think as you said, I think for the vast majority of people, and I would cite the numbers if I could remember them off the top of my head, but they have done research where they took even trained lifters and had them approximate, I think it was like a 6 rep max on a squat. And then they put them in a situation where they had like a coach yelling at them and whatever. And a lot of these people, their 6 rep max that they approximated was actually a 12 or 13 or 14 rep max.
Yeah.
So these people who thought that they were training to failure were actually training with 5, 6, 7, 8 RIR. And we're
experienced lifters too, like you're saying.
And experienced lifters. Like these weren't even newbies.
Yeah.
I think the cutoff was you had to have if I remember correctly, it was like you had to have a 6 rep max of 100 kilo squat.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not elite lifters, but you're squatting 2 plates for reps. They're at least people that have some experience in the gym. So I think a lot of people are much further away from training to failure than they think that they are. And I'll say training, like failure is actually kind of a vague concept. Because part of that is like failure where? Failure of what?
True. Yeah.
So we talk about, I think of opportunities with like lengthened partials, which is something that's become more and more popular.
And we talk about it in hypertrophy intensive.
Exactly. But it's like, let's say we talk about like a pull up or a pull down. Because we understand the mechanics of that, you are going to fail in that short position.
Mm-hmm.
So did you reach failure when you couldn't get all the way down? Or did you reach failure when you did 5, 6, 7, 8 additional reps that were partial reps? Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of those things where part of that definition can be a little bit ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's context and exercise specific. But I would say, as you had mentioned, we know just how important effort is when it comes to driving progress, to the point where, and I say this as somebody who loves getting into the weeds with stuff. You could have someone who has an absolutely horrible program and potentially terrible technique. And if they just train like they've got a gun to their head all the time, they will make more progress than the person who has flawless technique with a fantastic, well thought out program that doesn't train very hard. Mm-hmm. Like that's how important it is. And I would rather err on the side of getting there. It's always easier to get to a point where now all you need to do is learn how to throttle back. And I think a lot of the time when people are worried about recovery, first of all, you need to train hard enough to have fatigue to manage in the first place. Fatigue management doesn't matter if there's no fatigue that's actually being accrued. And a lot of the time, I think that people have opportunities with outside of the gym aspects when it comes to recovery as well. Depending on the person, maybe the gym is the thing that you need to dial it back. But I think for the most part, people would be better off over indexing on training harder than they think that they are.
Do you
So
think that self-limiting behavior comes more from like fear of injury, or is it just not knowing your limits and thinking like, oh, this is the end because you've never pushed further than that?
I
Or
think
is
it
there
could
a
be
bit of both?
both.
Yeah.
I think it's both. I do think it's a skill.
Hmm.
And I think you see that
what do
when
you
you
mean by
look at
skill?
really,
Because I would define that in a way, but I'm curious how you would define the skill of like effort. Like, what do you mean by that?
I think that there is partially like a psychological skill
Yeah,
where
I
there's a
agree.
level of discomfort that comes with training really hard. And it's almost like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, but it's like developing like a callus.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you walk in your bare feet all the time and you're walking on rocks, if you have tender, soft feet, just walking on rocks for 5 minutes is going to, like, your feet are going to kill. And that sensation is really hard to bear. But over time, you start to develop a callus, and then therefore you're able to walk on those rocks for longer. I think that happens psychologically when it comes to training really hard. The
Mm-hmm.
first time you get to that point where like you feel like almost like someone is pulling your quads off the bone on the set of hack squats, you reach that point and you just dip your toe in. You're like, this is the worst this has ever felt. Like, that was really challenging. And over time, you become conditioned to that feeling and are able to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into that. So I think a lot of it is a psychological skill.
No doubt.
And what I would say in addition to that is I think what you see with really skilled lifters is not only can they tolerate that psychologically, I think that they also learn to adopt techniques that are very intentional to the tissues that they're trying to target.
Hmm.
So what does that mean? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
So let's I'll use a leg press as an example. Because of the discomfort element, your body is going to want to get out of that discomfort, and learning to not allow compromises within your technique. So starting to speed the rep cadence up, or let's say like lifting your butt off of the leg press to gain some kind of leverage, etc. But it's like, no, my goal on this is to have my knees go way over my toes, get a really deep like degree of knee flexion. I want to challenge my quads as hard as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter how painful this is, I'm going to maintain the same rep cadence and the same rep technique, rep after rep after rep, until this thing doesn't move. And I do think that takes a lot of practice.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. Thanks for elaborating on that, Alex. I wasn't sure what you meant initially, but I totally agree. And I think what I would like to add to this before we move to our second round is, if we think about how many facets of human behavior are tied to self-preservation in some way, shape, or form. Ryan, you mentioned the word conditioning, and I do think that there's likely a huge element of acquiring evidence that you can go into discomfort and that nothing catastrophic will happen, that there's a certain amount of like calibrating the sensitivity of the organism, that different people have different sensitivities, likely in part genetically, but also so much of it is learned. And we talk about a lot of this in the pain modules. And actually today in the internship, it was our third class specifically on pain. We talked a lot about this kind of stuff. And we think of, like, I use this analogy in the internship to kind of talk about this thing called central sensitization or peripheral sensitization. And the analogy is kind of a silly one, but I find it really hammers it home, which is like, if you imagine that as of tomorrow, WHO says that there's like a new breed of mosquito that we have in, let's say, North America, and it's spreading a deadly pathogen that, like, if you get stung, 100% guarantee of death. We don't have the antidote at all. How would you feel to the sensation of like the wind brushing against your skin, or, and your hairs moving a little bit? It would be like likely very, very, very heightened. Even though it's the same objective stimulus of like wind on your hair that you've had millions of times throughout your life. It's just that now it's flagged. And so it just goes to show how the sensitivity of the organism can be calibrated holistically, but then also like in very specific manners. And and that is informed by like our beliefs about what is happening and the evidence that we've accrued. And so I think that like the more that people go there, and even like within injury rehab, this is a huge part of the rehabilitation that I do with people, is like eventually you need to take them, at least in my experience, it's very beneficial to create really uncomfortable levels of fatigue, because when people get injured, generally they lump all of these uncomfortable symptoms into this like bad bucket, like bad for me bucket. Like this is like injury, this is no bueno. And they need to learn how to kind of tease out the differences between all of those things. So kind of like drawing some parallels here between like the pain world and what we're talking about effort, where you need to be able to go there and for it to not have a bad label on it, but for you to be able to be like, this is exactly why I'm fucking here, right? Like from a resistance training perspective, your goal is to beat the shit out of that like very specific area if you're looking to do hypertrophy work.
Yeah.
So why are you complaining? Like this is exactly why you're here. So quit avoiding the damn challenge and like get in there, you know? And so like people getting in reps of doing that and going further, noticing that nothing bad happened, and then being like, oh, that's interesting. And then you can kind of like continue that process and take them maybe not farther every single workout, but gradually over time, incrementally, you can. And that's how I would describe the kind of psychological piece that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to throw one little thing in before we move on, because I think it's cool. There was a piece of research came out very recently. I'm not sure who conducted it, but it was presented by Menno Henselman. And they took, again, I think it was trained male lifters, and they compared the difference in certainly hypertrophy. I don't remember if they had measured strength as well. And they compared lifters who trained with a lifting partner versus lifters who had trained with a trainer. And the training, the personal trainer group had statistically significant better outcomes than the group that just had a training partner, which I think was really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
And this was even, it was only with the trainers giving instruction and encouragement, because they were given preset programs, preset cadence. So it goes to show you, like, especially if you have a trainer who's really good at coaching and programming and all those other things, you can only imagine that those effects would even be more heightened.
No doubt. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to mention one other thing real quick in terms of like, there's, you know, I've noticed in the last few years of training for very, very different things that there's a very different kind of effort required, and it's its own specificity. You know, comparing like resistance training for hypertrophy and going to failure there is a very different sensation than doing like a 3-rep max and going to failure there, where it's just like the fear that the bar is going to come down on you
100%.
Versus interval training and getting into that like deep cardiovascular discomfort, or even doing like long cardio sessions where like you're not getting into that like insane heart rate and breathing, but like going for over an hour, if you're not used to it, just like has its own, you kind of got to get into like almost like a meditative state to get through it and like get your mind in a place where you can just kind of go steady on. All of those are their own thing that requires its own specificity. And like, if you are used to the discomfort of resistance training, it'll probably carry over a bit, I think, into those other worlds, but I think they require kind of their own push too.
To your point, leading up to my marathon, unfortunately I got injured, and the longest that I had ran was 28K in training. The marathon's 42. And everyone always talks about how like the wall is in the 30s, usually 31 or 32K, you hit something. Mm-hmm. And I'd never experienced it prior to race day. And like, it's real. And like, if we're talking about specificity, there's a huge difference in like the quality and the texture of the fatigue between, you know, kilometer 28 and 33. Like, it's a completely different event, which seems, it sounds so weird to say that. But the like inner game and how it feels and what you're pushing up against, completely different, even though it's only like, you know, 2 to 4K away. So I would totally agree with you, man. Let's get into our second round, round. Brett, take us away.
Me start. This is going to be another, probably it's a complicated one, or it might be easy for you guys, but it's one that I've gone back and forth on over the years. Lower body training machines. So like a hack squat, leg extension, leg curl, abductor, adductor, leg press.
I'm going to say underrated. Only because, and I think I have a quick answer for this. I think that there's still a bias towards barbell movements that exists. Like they're something magical as opposed to just another tool that you can use. And I think that certain machines allow you to be hyper specific if required. And in addition, I'm going to separate, because I think a lot of people leg pressing, hack squats, stuff like that, I think are relatively popular. I'm going to add even things like the machine adductors, for example, especially for men, highly underrated.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in particular, if you are in physique sport, if you want to improve the size of your legs, a lot of people undertrain their adductors and don't realize just how fucking big they are.
Yeah, agreed.
So I think that I'm going to say underrated for those reasons, which it doesn't mean that they aren't popular, but I think that there's still a bias against them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think that whether or not they're overrated, underrated might be kind of population specific. So for instance, like you're saying, for folks that are either physique competitors, athletes, even people who have like a high level of functioning already, generally they tend to, I think, leverage those tools less and appreciate them less. So I would say for those populations, I would say it's underrated. Excuse me. For the everyday person, I might say overrated, simply because I think that it's an area of comfort for a lot of folks, and it's a good place to start. And unfortunately, I think it's where a lot of people end. And there's a lot of benefit to also doing other exercises that have a potentially a higher potential of putting more systemic load on the body, if we're talking like a deadlift or squats, what have you, barbell bench, etc. And so, yeah, I think that perhaps for, like, as we say in French, Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde. So for like for everyday folks, I would say a little bit overrated, because I think people cling to the comfort and the familiarity of the machines that they start on. And for athletic folks, I would say underrated.
Yeah.
I do think it's funny that you mentioned barbell bench, because Brett explicitly said lower body movements.
Oh, shoot. Sorry.
I'm just imagining, you guys have probably seen this reel that's gone on a bunch where it's like having trouble balancing your split squat, and then they adjust the bench and then they just bench instead.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I blacked out when you mentioned the lower body part. I was just thinking about bench.
I like, throughout my training life, I've gone through like various waves, and I think part of it is like popular media. And I think, Ryan, like you and I, although we train in two very different worlds, I think we've gone through a bit of a similar like path of interest, in that, like, I was training for sport, and then I read like Starting Strength, and at the time the fitness subreddit on Reddit was all about barbell lifting and starting strength. And it was like, and the only thing they would recommend is like, oh, you're new to fitness, read Starting Strength. And it's like, why? Anyways, so I was like, all barbell, all free weight. Like, what's the point of machines? They're just a waste of time. And yeah, I've definitely come around. And I think that's a really great point that you made, Etienne, is that like a lot of people are pushed, because at these big corpo gyms, it's a really efficient use of their time to have somebody run through the machines. The next person can jump on, and 5 minutes later get them out of the door and take their money, and it's a pretty efficient use of their time and space for the gym's perspective. But I think people don't really realize that like these machines probably should be used more for more experienced lifters, even though there's such a low bar for entry. I think they're probably better utilized for more experienced people who are kind of like at the end of their workout and wanting to push things to kind of like that full fatigue level. And, you know, a new lifter probably, you know, unless they've got some injuries or some specific issues, I think can probably get more out of free weights as when they start.
And to your point, you know, the like machines, I really appreciate your point where it's like, it might actually be more beneficial, or perhaps experienced lifters might actually get more out of it. In part because, you know, like machines are so, like setup is so crucial on these things. And because of like the fixed paths that they move through. And so if you have someone who's 5-0 doing we'll use the chest press as an example, 5-0 with the seat all the way to the bottom, and they're pressing up kind of like this, you know, and it's like, well, I mean, sure, you could do that, and you can definitely apply some progressive overload there, but you're not going to be able to load it very well because of the setup. And and how would I say? And so, you know, I do think that an experienced lifter would likely be able to get more out of it. They've got more experience that they can apply to kind of tailoring how they're positioning themselves in the machine so that they can then truly go hard. So I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah.
Cool. We go into
RDT.
Yeah. All right.
Yep.
So my second one here is manual therapy. So specifically here, what I have in mind is massage and chiro for rehab. And rehab, I think we're going to define it specifically as being fixing mechanical abnormalities that are drivers of pain. So that's the specific way in which I'm framing my question. So overrated or underrated when it comes to fixing the body, and then coaxing pain out of the body. What are your takes?
Yeah, that distinction changed my answer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking specifically mechanically, completely overrated.
Mm-hmm.
If I think about something, you know, like massage, for example, I think that there is this notion that some people have that massage like breaks down scar tissue or whatever it happens to be. And first of all, it is too superficial for that to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this before in regards to like fascial stretch therapy and people thinking that you can somehow stretch fascia independent of musculature, etc. I think a lot of those mechanisms probably are not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And then I will add, if we did not have the caveat fixing mechanical issues, I think it's, I would say, appropriately related if we're talking about recovery, if we're talking it from strictly a neurological standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brett, what do you think, man?
Yeah, 100% agree. Like the mechanical thing is the big caveat is like, I think there is a big psychological part to like being in a small room with a person that you trust who's laying hands on you is a huge effect that can't be, you know, put down. But like if we're talking just mechanical, I really don't know how much they're actually doing. Like more and more evidence is coming out regarding chiros and massage, and I've mentioned this before. I don't think we should completely throw it out just because it's not doing the things we think it does, or at least not doing the things we want it to in the ways we think it does. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. Like I don't think we need to throw it out entirely, but yeah, fixing mechanical issues definitely overrated.
Yeah, for sure, man. So to kind of echo what you guys have said, because I completely agree. In the training industry, with the like accumulation of data that we've had of how wrong we've been about the like mechanistic drivers of how these things help, it's resulted in a lot of people poo-pooing manual therapy, from massage to physio to you know, fascial stretch therapy, lacrosse balls, which would be self myofascial, but you get the idea. It's led to people kind of discounting them entirely. And so I think, once again, mechanistically, I think they're very off the mark, and our understanding, I don't think we fully understand them at all. I don't know if we ever will, just given the interdependency of the system of the human body, excuse me, and how pain can be just modulated by so many different things. So it's like, and we'll circle back to that in a moment. But I think in practice, I think appropriately rated. I think that people have fallen in love with manual therapy, if perhaps specifically massage for a reason, helps people feel better, and it can help them, either have less pain with the same amount of stuff, or it can help desensitize the system and help them accumulate more. And so for that, in that sense, I think it's appropriately rated in practice, but once again, mechanistically, I think our understanding of it is very flawed.
I got a question for you guys.
Yeah, of course.
So medicine and doctors have had a pretty auspicious history, like, going pre-1800s, there was a lot of wacky stuff that quote unquote doctors were doing. But throughout the years and iterating and, focusing on research, they've become a well-respected and trusted industry. Chiropractic, even though it's newer, has a kind of similar kind of wacky origin story. Like, I'm pretty sure the guy who started it is something along the lines of like ghosts were talking to him to like fix subluxations or something like that. Do you think chiropractic could potentially have a similar swing and come around? Should they focus on research, or do you think that it's going to kind of become or continue being kind of like a niche and continue focus on maybe the stuff that isn't quite as research focused, we'll say?
Well, if I may, I'll take a swing at this.
Go ahead.
I think that I think and I hope that it will evolve for the better, in the same way where I think some of the best practitioners of massage therapy that I know understand that from a tissue quality perspective, they're really not changing anything. But what they are do is they're really creating a powerful therapeutic effect for their clients. And the medium that they're leveraging to help people with that is massage. And I think that my guess is that as scientifically rigorous folks kind of make their way into the world of chiropractic care, folks who are like intellectually honest about what it offers and what it doesn't, and are willing to change their opinions over time as it gets scrutinized and we refine our understanding of it, I think that our application of chiropractic care is going to become increasingly precise and increasingly powerful. That'll be my guess. I don't think it's going to get discarded or perhaps viewed in a way that's kind of woo woo. I'm hopeful that it'll become more powerful, because I mean, ultimately that's what we need. We don't need fewer tools. I think we need perhaps either the same amount or more, but with the caveat that we need to just like better understand where do they fit in someone's recovery journey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would, if I could, I would categorize there being sort of two very broad groups of chiropractors. I think there are the ones that have the business model that is like a conveyor belt where they have 10-minute sessions. Yeah. It's very non-specific. I don't think they're doing much. And I would probably take issue with some clinical integrity that they might have. And the chiropractors that I have seen that I have a lot of respect for, that I also think get really great results, are those that use their anatomy and physiology understanding that they've accrued from their education and often integrate that into some form of strength training. Mm-hmm. So that blend I've seen be quite successful. And those are typically like, I can think of a variety of people off the top of my head that have sort of ended up in this in-between space of almost practitioner and coach. And I think that that's maybe where some of the magic lies. Mm-hmm. The other thing I was going to say, just in regards to massage, just because I have my own anecdote, because I've had a variety of, massage, physio, et cetera, over the years, and then haven't for quite a while, just for practical reasons, essentially. And I very recently started working with a massage therapist again. So I train her, and then I basically get a 2-hour massage weekly. And we had talked about on this podcast before that I'd had issues with my elbow since essentially July of last year.
Mm-hmm.
Haven't had a pain-free, I don't even want to say session. Like, I haven't had a pain-free rep in like 6 months. And certainly within the last 2 weeks, I've had sessions that were almost 100% pain-free with my elbow. And I would say, like, again, she didn't magically fix my elbow, but very similar, where whether we understand the mechanism or not is irrelevant because the outcome is improved.
Mm-hmm.
So that's shout out to Alyssa. She's done a good job.
Yeah, it's great.
But that's something where, like, the result has then led to, because this is what I really care about, is my training is now more productive because the pain experience that I'm having is significantly decreased, and then I can just train harder, progressively overload, etc.
Mm-hmm. Love that, man. That's good. Yeah, and awesome. Shout out to, you said Alyssa?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. All right, man. Go for it.
Overrated or underrated? Matching resistance profiles to strength profiles.
Ooh, overrated. In my opinion. Brett, what do you think?
Me too.
Can you explain it a little bit more?
Trying to think of the quickest way. So we know that with strength profiles, very generally speaking, it would be descriptive of there are different joint positions where you are able to produce more force or less force.
Mm-hmm.
And then a resistance profile would describe where an exercise is easy and where it's hard.
Gotcha.
So there was a trend for a period of time where people would want to match where the exercise was really, really difficult with the joint position where you were quite strong, and then have the exercise get easier in the joint position where you might be weaker.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, man. Didn't mean to cut you off.
Overrated.
Overrated.
Now that I got the definition, for sure.
Yeah. So I'm going to add a little bit of a potential caveat, but still it's net overrated. I've definitely made up my mind on this one, at least at this point. If we just think about, how would I say, just one piece, I think, just kind of throws a wrench in the whole idea, which is the accumulation of fatigue. And I know you know this, Rye, but like the moment you start introducing fatigue, how we express strength completely changes. And so, not completely, but it changes in predictable manners. And there aren't machines that match that perfectly. So like the notion of matching it perfectly is essentially out of the window anyways. That being said, I think that there could be, like, if there was the possibility of having like machines that approximated it, isn't perfect, but that approximated it well, and they were like high output machines, which like MedX makes some interesting pieces. Nautilus has made a few Cybex as well. But MedX in particular has made a lot of really great ones, but I digress. I think that stuff can be really useful, especially for folks who have like limited amount of time to train and they want to do like one thing for a body part or a muscle group, and they want to challenge it like thoroughly with one exercise because of time constraints. I do think that there could be some really great applications there. Because essentially it would mean that you're not just, like you mentioned earlier when we were talking about failure, it means that you're not just hitting failure at one portion of the rep, but rather you're going to be hitting more, like a more thorough experience of failure, perhaps through the bottom, the middle, the top, etc. It likely won't be perfect, but it'll be a little bit more complete in terms of where your ability to approximate failure through various joint positions. It'll be kind of like more thorough. So I think that there could be some applications there, but I do think that those applications are few and far in between, and that like that's not the majority of what we're talking about. If we're talking about this from a like an athletic standpoint, I think it's very overrated. I think from a hypertrophy perspective, I think it's overrated. Rehab perspective, I think it's overrated, although it can really inform quite predictably where people will have pain flares. So for instance, if you know that a given exercise, and this is one of the themes that's going to be in the kind of like new pain course and rehab course that I'm assembling, is being able to understand where load's the greatest. And then also layering that with an understanding of perhaps where we're strong and where we're weak, once again, allows you to better understand relative stress and thus in a certain way kind of predict where someone is perhaps likely to experience pain signaling. So I think it does have an understanding of the components is therapeutically useful, but within the context of performance enhancement and hypertrophy, I think it's really, really, really overrated.
Yeah, so I would also say overrated. And shockingly, it's like you and I work together. Our answers are quite aligned. So you kind of took a couple of things that I wanted to know.
Because you steal my thunder all the time. So when I answer, I try to be as thorough as possible because I try to like out angle this motherfucker on the mic, you know?
And this is where, again, it's a little bit pedantic, but I would say the language of match versus approximate, I think changes this.
Yeah.
Match, I think borderline useless because as you had mentioned, you almost can't. Approximate, I think, could be useful. And I would say even more specifically, having an understanding of where the overload is in an exercise and whether that is matching what your intent is, that matters. So it's like, is this exercise really, really challenging in a lengthened position? And is that what I want? Or is this exercise really challenging in a shortened position? And is that what I want? And I think those generalities is probably what matters. And then, as you had mentioned, having an understanding of where we might predictably see a reduction in force production also allows us to predict what's going to happen through the performance of a set, et cetera, and then informs decisions that we make.
100%.
So it's not that these tools aren't useless. In fact, I think they're incredibly useful. I just think trying to find the perfect exercise is it's an exercise in futility. It's impossible to do.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a Rottweiler chasing its tail. Like
I don't have a lot of opinions on this just because this is not at all my wheelhouse. So I'm learning a lot from hearing you guys talk about it, but cool. Loading profiles and stuff is something that is still pretty new to me and I'm still learning about.
Cool. Man, appreciate it.
What's your third point?
Last time around, let's do it.
Well, this is definitely my wheelhouse, but sport specific exercises and movements. So like trying to get similar body positions as your sport in a training environment.
It's funny, I just had a debate about this at the gym.
Yeah.
I'm going to say slightly overrated.
Mm-hmm.
And what I will say is I think that when we look at, for the most part, what generally yields the greatest outcomes, if we're talking specifically about strength and conditioning, because one thing I want to note is I do think that there is a difference between strength and conditioning training and sport practice. And differentiating between those two things I think is really important. Your strength and conditioning should prepare. For most people, just being stronger likely yields the greatest outcomes. The way that I look at sport-specific training, do I think that like a soccer player should be kicking around a medicine ball, or ET had mentioned like a baseball player singing a weighted bat? Again, another exercise in futility, in my opinion. But what I do think that we can do, and this is why I said slightly, and I think it's probably kind of in this gray zone, is if we look at what are the components of the movements and positions that an athlete has to get into for their sport, and then can we train those individual components? So it's like if you have a baseball player, let's say a pitcher, in general, them getting stronger at, I'll just say squatting, like if they squat more, if they lunge more, they could do more pull-ups. The overall improvements in their athletic performance is going to be driven a lot by just generally being stronger. But we also know that there is a certain degree of striding down the mound that they need to achieve. There's a certain, they call it like extension when they're pitching. There's a certain degree of rotation that they need to have. So if you start to be able to break down, like, what are the individual movements that this person needs to do to perform their sport? And then, like, can I train that rotation in isolation? Can I train that like hip internal and external rotation in isolation? Can I like start to make those individual components better? Can I give them a greater degree of ability to produce force, etc.? And then they integrate that into their sport practice. That's sort of how I think about it.
Yep. ET, you got something to say before?
Yeah, excuse me. I was just making a note so I didn't forget it. I 100% agree with everything you said, Rye, and I only have one thing to add to it. And I guess the distinction, because Brett, your question was like
sport-specific movements, but like specifically getting into similar body positions that you would the sport requires of you in the training context.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that for me, the way that I would kind of categorize it would be: are we talking about like training the body to tolerate specific forces associated to certain joint positions, of the sport? So once again, an example would be like you mentioned a pitcher, but also being able to tolerate like a lot of external rotation torque right here, I would view that. I would view like internal rotation work here as being very sport specific. But the way in which it wouldn't be sport specific, I think the way that perhaps most people think about it is that it doesn't mimic the sport. And I think there's a difference between the training of components, like you mentioned, Rye, from like an anatomical perspective versus loaded mimicry. I think loaded mimicry is atrociously overrated.
Yeah.
But I think the training of components as a means of beefing up the system is maybe appropriately rated. I don't think it's underrated. I would go probably appropriately rated for that. And like, how would I say, like in an analogy, if we think about this within the context of like an orchestra, is like if the orchestra is having a hard time, like working on each individual component, like if the trumpet section is really, really like lagging behind everyone else, like just doing an ass load of practice with the band might not be productive for that group. Like maybe they need a little bit more specialized attention because ET's in there. He's trying to play the trumpet and he's autistic and he needs help. Right. And all of those things are true.
More flute guy kind of vibes.
Yeah. Flute guy. That's right. Yeah. I actually did trumpet in high school, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That's why I said all of those things are true. But I think that, there's a huge amount of validity to specialized attention to the specific regions of the body to prepare them for the loads, and then reintegrating and practicing the skill. So if we use baseball as an example, we use the weighted bat as an example, like really training like a ton of like upper body strength, rotational strength, and improving like rate of force development in the upper body, total force production potential, very valuable. And then you take this beefed up engine, and then you practice it. You practice the application. I think that that's incredibly useful. But once again, loaded mimicry, I think is atrociously overrated.
Definitely.
I just want to add just a cliff note to that. Simply put, people will often call that like isolation versus integration. So you're talking about like isolating the individual component and then integrating that into a more complex system.
100%. Yeah. So in contrast to like doing like practicing your layups with a weighted basketball.
Yeah.
Just breaking the backboard.
Yeah. Like even like, or I saw another one where the guy was talking about training something very specific in the gym. So that way when you're doing a layup, you can take a hit. And I'm like, so the problem with that is that when you're doing a layup, you're not anchored to anything. Like in many ways, strength is kind of irrelevant because you're floating. So it's about mass against mass when you're in the air. So like, I don't know. Like, I think that like when it comes to like training that specifically in the context of the gym, it's kind of dumb, but generally speaking, getting stronger and perhaps heavier, totally very, very useful. So once again, I really categorize it as like loaded, like mimicking of the sport.
I like that distinction.
Yeah. Versus like the training of the components.
Definitely. Yeah. So there's the two things that I consider when I run into an athlete or a team for training. And one that you guys nailed was like not necessarily mimicking the components of the sport, but identifying which tissues are loaded and used in the sport, and then training those and finding
Beautifully
exercises
said.
that will load those. The
Yeah.
other thing that you guys didn't mention, though, is energy systems, and training specific energy systems too. So in ski racing, a ski race run is usually no longer than 2 minutes. So in our case, like our training sessions are a whole day, but in terms of competition, we only really need that effort to last 2 minutes, and that's it. So my
Sounds like my
athletes,
first time.
I knew it.
my athlete's ability to like run a fast 10K isn't going to carry over very well to ski racing. They do need a certain amount of cardio to be able to sustain a full day of training, but that's really the only necessity for that kind of long-term cardio. So that's one thing I'll throw in there too, is that energy systems are something important we got to train.
100%, and very specific,
Mm-hmm.
right? You think like someone who's, if we use like two completely kind of like the polar opposites, you think of someone that wants to get really, really good at the 100-meter sprint, getting them to go run for 4 hours straight or 2 hours straight, likely not that beneficial for them just because of how different they are in terms of specificity. And of course, at a certain point, like being more aerobically fit, having a larger aerobic engine is going to be useful for the 100, but they're so different that like if you stray too far from that, if we think about the adaptations, we want the adaptations within the body to be specific. At that point, those adaptations wouldn't necessarily drive performance within the task that we're interested in. Right. Yeah. But yeah, so I agree 100%. Cool.
All right,
So,
I think that's your point.
So what's our answer for this one? If we're talking about sports specific training, overrated, underrated, appropriately rated?
I think we said overrated as long as we're, my strict definition of like mimicking sport movements in a loaded fashion in the gym.
Mimicry, atrociously overrated.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Training the components, appropriately rated.
Agreed.
That's so nerdy, and I love it.
Me too.
All right. So for me, and this is just, all right, here we go. So my third point, exercise as a therapeutic intervention. So specifically pain reduction, appropriately rated.
I thought you meant like psychologically.
I mean, sure.
I was like, go to a fucking therapist.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about that. Yeah. So exercise as a therapeutic intervention, specifically with pain reduction, was basically point number one. But then also, even if we're talking about this within the context of someone's psychological well-being, what do you guys think?
I mean, I think for the most of the population, it's still quite underrated. Like the first thing somebody wants to do when their back hurts is like, oh, I got to go lie down. It's like, no, no.
That's exactly where I was going to go with this. Yeah.
I think that there are certain populations who will tend to overdo it and like run through pain and train through pain, and it's probably not great, but and in a dangerous way. But I think for most of the population, their first instinct is to immediately immobilize. That rice thing is still like driven into their brain. It's like, it hurts, so I must not move it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I'm going to, echo a lot of what Brett said. I would say if we're looking at how most people tend to think about approaches to rehabbing injuries, etc., I think it's highly underrated. Because most people, as Brett said, kind of err on the side of do nothing. And I think there's a massive responsibility for medical professionals to communicate that differently. I think part of the risk is medical professionals communicate protocols based on reducing their risk of being sued for malpractice.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is the problem, because it isn't the advice that yields the best outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And, besides mechanistically, I think some of the things that we understand about what goes into the rehabilitation process, I think we've also seen this, we had Paul O'Neid on here recently, and he's a great example of a guy who had a catastrophic injury.
Mm-hmm.
And what was fascinating about his process is, besides some of the pharmaceutical intervention that he had, which was interesting in its own right, when he was essentially on bed rest, anything that he could do functionally, he did. It was like, oh, my knees are completely braced, but I can just like flex my quads and wiggle my feet. I'll do that. I can move my knees 5 degrees. I'll do that. And he he took whatever was in front of him. And this is a guy who, Brett, I don't know if you were familiar with this, but he had essentially a double avulsion fracture, I think, of his patella, squatting like 7 something. He's got scars like this big on both knees. And he's now, I don't know what the time frame would be now, maybe 6 to 8 months post-op.
So he's the one guy on the planet whose knees did explode from squatting.
They fully exploded. But he's literally a guy that, he trains at my gym, and we had a leg workout together recently. And he leg pressed, 6.5, 7 plates for 15 reps, full range of motion after an injury that severe. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's an accident that he's able to do that in a relatively short time span when you consider like all of the things that he did. So I think that it is massively underrated, and even more so because I think it is such an incredibly powerful tool.
Powerful tool in what sense? Like, you mean like when it comes to promoting, I guess, like tissue growth, or like, what do you mean?
Both. So like I should say it's incredibly powerful in the rehabilitation process, not just with the physiological adaptations to the tissues, but also the neurological adaptations of getting into certain joint positions and decreasing that perception of threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I agree. And I think I wanted to table this as, I think, an overrated, underrated, just as like a selfish plug, just because I find this stuff really interesting. But yeah. I'm very much in the camp of exercise being very underrated when it comes to its possibility to lead to net therapeutic adaptations in people's lives, whether that be the same amount of pain, but becoming a little bit more tolerant to it and being able to live your life and do fulfilling things simply because you don't have a catastrophic view of yourself because you don't think you're made of glass, or just, exercise and other modalities. It's not limited to exercise, but just exercise seems like it's like just really powerful as leading or very powerful at creating or leading to net desensitizations of the body. One thing that I find is like people confuse or perhaps conflate, I'm not sure what would be the right word here, but people often confuse or conflate injury and pain, and those are just absolutely not the same thing. Sometimes they happen at the same time, sometimes they don't. And here specifically, I'm talking about exercise and pain reduction. I'm not talking about bouncing back from an injury, because although as you load the body, it can promote tissues to adapt and get stronger. Yes, absolutely. So long as the host can do it. But how would I say, I think the most powerful effects have to do with like the analgesic effects of exercise, not only acutely, but over the long run, and how people's pain levels can go way down really, really, really quickly in a manner that isn't proportionate to the healing, meaning areas can still be in the process of healing, and the amount of pain that we experience goes down a lot. And some people view that as being bad, but I don't. I think it's viewed, the way that I view it is that so many folks, because a lot of people have this kind of false equivalency between I hurt, and so therefore there's a proportionate amount of damage that I'm experiencing. And for a lot of folks, when they feel something, they're very scared. And I don't think that that's productive. I haven't found that to be productive in many cases. And I think that connection, people need to learn that that's a far weaker connection than we previously thought. And usually what ends up happening is, as you expose the body to stressors in a gradual manner, the body, like the sensitivity of the system, both systemically and locally, just starts to get calibrated appropriately. I don't think it gets under calibrated. I've never seen that, but I've seen it get appropriately calibrated, meaning people will still experience some sensitivity and some discomfort when you push up against what would be very normal and understandable limits. And it's just that they are no longer experiencing a lot of pain at non-noxious levels of stuff. So then thus they can live an interesting and meaningful life. They can pursue bodybuilding. They can do running. In our last podcast, we had talked about doing a case study right?
Yeah.
Like the three of us. And one of the gentlemen that I was thinking of bringing up, I'm currently working with, his feet are like, his left foot in particular are like 50 shades of fucked. Just like you look at his foot, you're like, whoa, that's like,
Yeah.
never seen a foot like that, you know? And is that congenital? Is that due to things that he's gone through his life? Or these adaptations? Neither here or I have any idea. And he's always been a runner. He's always loved that stuff. And so he was like, oh, you know, I'd like to like work on my foot and maybe I can start running again. And within our first session, it was evident that he was ready to run. It was blatantly, it was, at least to me, it was really, really evident. But he hadn't ran in 15 years. So of course, I don't want you to go run a 10K or a 5K, but like, let's start building you up a little bit, little by little. The dose dictates the poison, and so anyways, in his case, by normalizing discomfort and slowly loading the area over time and desensitizing it, like he ran an 11K on Saturday, and he signed up for like a trail race the same weekend that I'm doing my 51, and the big thing for him was educating him about the lack of the hard connection between hurt and harm. That was like the big thing. And trying and like stacking wins and gathering evidence that he could feel that and nothing catastrophic would happen. And that's been net propelling for him. So yeah, I think we're all kind of on the same page. So I put a little bow on this, at least for me. I think it's really, really, really underrated when it comes to pain reduction specifically.
Damn, I feel like we're going out on a whimper now because that was a great conversation.
No, let's go. We'll make this a good send off.
I have one of two. I have one written down and then one I thought of that.
Go with the spicy one. Just go with the spicy one.
All right. This because I'm more curious about your guys' opinion.
Okay.
Overrated or underrated PEDs and results in training?
Ooh, I actually thought about this earlier today. I was thinking of tabling that. Yeah. Brett, what do you think? I'll go after.
PEDs and their results, overrated or underrated? Like,
is this hypertrophy or sport or both?
However you want to look at it.
Okay.
I don't really know how to answer that. Like the results exist and they are definitely going to help. The stronger athletes are usually better athletes. Appropriately rated, I guess. I don't know how to answer this one.
So my stance.
I'm really curious about ETs because we've done a couple podcasts.
Yeah.
And I feel like your knowledge base has increased. And I'm like really curious how you think about it now.
Sure. Yeah. I think very overrated.
Okay.
Yeah. I think overrated because you can be sauced to the gills, but if you're not training hard, you're not going to get anything out of it. So I think that like over indexing on pharmacology as a means of kind of like bypassing effort is something that happens a lot nowadays.
Big time.
And so for that reason, I think it's really overrated. And that's not talking about whether or not it's effective or not. Like if we think about if people train hard and they dose things appropriately, massively effective. But if we think about, I think perhaps for most folks, the reasons why they use PEDs for hypertrophy and performance enhancement, they're majoring in minor things, so to speak, in the sense that it's like, and that's kind of a statement to say that PEDs are a minor thing, but it's minor in relation to effort. It's minor in relation to nutrition, and it's minor in relation to sleep. And so, yeah, that would be my answer. I would say overrated.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think that the big tenets of making progress, I'll say in my world, specifically hypertrophy or strength, but I think that this would apply, in any sport. You still have to train really damn hard. You still have to have a nutritious diet. You still need to recover, etc. Mm-hmm. And there is no drug that will squat for you. There's no drug that will run the 100-meter race for you. So I think that there's no substitute for that. So I think overrated in the sense that people think that it's a silver bullet or like a magic solution. But I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench in this a bit. I think that in particular when we start talking about peptides, I think that they are underrated in their health promotion abilities. So we talk, something like metabolic disease, pre-diabetes, etc., dementia, cardiac risk. These are all things a lot of people are faced with, and probably increasingly so as I think that the average person becomes more sedentary, diets become more processed, etc. And I think that there's some really interesting utility for some of these medications. We've talked about this a variety of times. I think of something like retatrutide. We had Anthony, it's Castor was his last name?
Castor, yeah.
On here yesterday.
I always want to call him Castore. Castore.
I know.
Because he has Italian blood. I want to do this every time.
From Ohio.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he very much echoed what my sentiments would be, where like retatrutide is a borderline miracle drug. So I think that there is this utility for health promotion that is almost, I think it is underexplored and understood by the general public.
Agreed, 100%.
And if we're talking about being a big, jacked, muscular guy, I think of like the 22-year-old gym bro.
Yeah.
It's completely overrated.
Yeah.
I'll steal a phrase from Justin Harris that I really like. Is most people figure this out over time. He's like, take a group of 10, 25-year-old guys, like 25-year-old gym bros, and put them together. And all they want to talk about is like, what's your drug cycle? Take 10 pro bodybuilders who have been on the Olympia stage and put them together. And all they're talking about is what's your diet and what's your training.
Mm-hmm. And how are you sleeping?
Yeah. Do you have a CPAP? Like,
for sure.
Eventually you realize that these are tools, that they are effective and they certainly drive certain results, but they aren't magic and they aren't a substitute for the same basic shit that we probably should be doing anyway.
Yeah, man. I love that. I think I'm happy you brought that up because, I'm someone who's definitely guilty of having thrown the baby out with the bathwater, specifically with PEDs over the years. And it was kind of, I think, coming from the stance of like, I don't understand this stuff and I know it's powerful. And so it's just a no to me right now. And to be very frank, it still is a no because I don't feel like I understand it well enough. But one thing is for sure is that there are absolutely applications, or it seems like there are some very compelling applications for a variety of substances that have found their way into sport for the sake of health promotion. And also perhaps not only just like health, like physiological health, but like people being able to live fulfilling, rich lives that are loaded with the activities that they love. Like if we think about like how important strength is for that, how important, we talked about with our last two guests. I'm drawing blanks on their name. There's Anthony and then the gentleman before. Dean, excuse me. We talked a lot about like mitochondrial health with a variety of compounds. Like you're fucked if your mitochondria aren't functioning well, right? So like if there's things that we can do learned from the realm of performance enhancement that have positive spillover when it comes to just helping humans be humans, why not? And so long as the juice is worth the squeeze, which it seems like it is for a lot of these things, I would agree within that context, absolutely underrated and underappreciated. I think they've been discarded across the board because of their history. But man, honestly, some of the most scientifically rigorous people that I've met over the past year are meatheads who are on a lot of beer. And they're just like people who are walking chemistry sets and people who are like fascinated by that stuff. Like it's been really interesting and noticing like that has really violated my expectations over the years, how like scientifically rigorous that community is. And the contrast between that and the stereotypes that are held against that population, like that, there's an enormous chasm between those two things. So yeah, I agree with you, Rye, 100%.
I do think it's been really interesting, just to note those last couple of guests, because obviously this is an area that I find really fascinating. And I know, you had stated that it wasn't an area where you had a ton of knowledge.
Zero.
And watching the last couple of guests that we've had on that were experts in this, watching you taking notes, and I'm like watching the wheel in your brain just turn. I'm like, oh, this is cool. Not like, I don't care what you do, but just to see your brain, I can see that it is challenging previous like preconceptions that you had, which has been really cool.
Yeah.
Can you guys see any parallels between, like, we talked about machines and how potentially they could be used more for advanced lifters than newer lifters, but they're easy to get into? Could PEDs potentially kind of be in the same boat, in that, like, somebody comes in new to training and is like, oh, this seems easy, I can just take this and get big and strong, whereas they should be like getting all the essentials in line first before turning to that kind of thing?
I agree completely.
If I may, I think that within the context of training, I 100% agree. But I think within the context of health promotion for the general public, my hope is that the stigma for a lot of these things over time will disappear, and an understanding of those compounds will make its way into the hands of very skilled practitioners.
Yeah.
And at that level, I think at like more of a population level, I think that would be really exciting. And I wouldn't view that as being necessarily reserved for people who have necessarily checked all of the boxes. I would view it as being kind of something that could happen concurrently, low barrier of entry, and net really powerful for folks.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction between, are we talking about sport application or therapeutic application? If we're talking therapeutic, I agree with you entirely, ET. Again, it comes up a lot, but I think it's a relevant topic when we talk about the GLP-1s. We know that things like hunger signaling, food noise, etc., there's a massive genetic component to that. And I often liken it to people that say have ADHD. And if you're somebody who has a lot of food noise and a lot of hunger signaling, life is difficult. In the same way that somebody who maybe has untreated ADHD, life is difficult because whether you like it or not, you still have to integrate in the world with everybody else. And I think that these medications used therapeutically can have really profound positive effects on people's lives. When I talk about sport application, it's sort of I think what you had alluded to, Brett, and I think of, I have many conversations with 24-year-old gym dudes that want to get on this stuff. And I would say overwhelmingly, they need to learn how to diet better.
Yeah,
they need to not be partying on a Saturday night.
Yeah,
for sure.
Like, so for those people, it's like, look, if you are going to take these risks, these are they're a drug, like especially you're talking about anabolics. These are drugs that carry side effects with them, some of which could be quite profound. In order to not have a whole bunch of health problems, you need to have a lot of stuff in order ahead of time just to manage your own health outcomes. And I also think about, like, if you're going to take on those risks, you sure as hell better maximize the advantages that you're getting out of it. Like, why would you half-ass it? So I think when we're talking about from an actual performance enhancement standpoint, I think that there are behaviors and skills and stuff that need to be in place ahead of time. Therapeutically, as ET said, I think it's actually, I would love to see there be less and less of a stigma and see people be able to apply these things in a way that improves their quality of life.
Yeah, love that. And this episode here is likely going to come out the same week as Dean St. Mart's first episode, and we did 2 with him. And so truly, if you want to see someone who models scientific rigor and curiosity, and is chipping away at some of the stigmas associated with this stuff, not only from a performance perspective, but from a health promotion perspective, that that episode honestly blew my mind right open. And
Yeah,
we were like
I know.
40 minutes in. I'm like, fuck, we're having this guy for a part 2 for sure. Which
Yeah.
thankfully he agreed to doing while we were recording. I was like, bro,
Yeah.
number 2. And he's like, yeah, cool. We'll book it after. Right. So yeah.
I actually signed up for his education platform.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll have to, that's something I've been considering. So I'll have to talk to you about it after, but I'm likely going to be doing the same thing. And I'm probably going to hire him as well to consult with my blood work and stuff.
That's sick. That's awesome.
Yeah. I've never during that call, I was like, I trust him 100%. Like he's
so smart.
He's so thorough. I've never met someone, at least over this platform. And that's not to say that our guests haven't been all fantastic. But like Dean's on a level of thoroughness that I was just like, I was like sitting back in my chair at some point. Yeah, it was wild.
Yeah, it's like comparing other players in the NBA to LeBron. Like you're still in the fucking NBA, but LeBron's amazing.
But also LeBron is just like
you're not LeBron. Yeah. LeBron's LeBron.
LeBron is on a different level. Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah,
gentlemen, tonight's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys. Today was a lot of fun. I look forward to the next one. Take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Adios.
All right, brother.
Later.